Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We're very excited to have you all join us for a series of discussions on measurement, reporting, and verification best practices for biogas projects. Today's webinar is hosted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in partnership with the Global Methane Initiative. Before we start, I want to go over just a few webinar software tips. First, there are 3 ways to connect with the audio today. You can either listen through your computer speakers using the Call Me feature to receive an automated call, or use the number included in the webinar invitation. All participant lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar, regardless of the audio method that you choose. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the Q&A panel, and when submitting questions, please select all panelists from the drop-down menu before hitting send. This will ensure that all of the speakers see your questions. In the text of your question, please identify which speaker your question is for, and questions will be moderated at the end of today's session. And final materials, including a recording and webinar slides, will be posted to the Global Methane Initiative website. We'll also be asking several polling questions during today's webinar, and a Slido panel will appear when we open the first poll. To respond, please select your answer and hit send. We'll also have feedback questions at the end of the webinar and would really appreciate your feedback about today's webinar. So with that, let me first introduce myself. My name is Nick Elger, and I'm the program manager with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Climate Change Division, where I work on methane emissions mitigation efforts in the U.S. and globally in the agriculture, waste, and oil and gas sectors. With me today is Gerardo Canales, Executive Director of Implementa Sur, and Zach Eiler, Vice President of Ruby Canyon Environmental. We have a great agenda planned for today. First, I'll kick things off with a high-level discussion of MRV best practices and dive into some of the high-level best practices from GMI's Policymaker Handbook for MRV. I'll then hand it over to Gerardo Canales to discuss practical applications for measurement and reporting, and then pass it over to Zach Eiler to discuss best practices and applications for verification. And we'll close today's session with a Q&A session, and I encourage everyone to drop their questions into the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Before diving into the best practices for MRV, I'd like to just provide a quick overview of the Global Methane Initiative, or GMI for short. GMI is an international public-private partnership focused on reducing methane emissions and capturing and utilizing methane as a source of clean energy. There are 46 countries that are members of GMI and over 700 project network members. And together, the project network members and countries work to abate methane emissions in 3 main sectors of anthropogenic methane emissions. The biogas sector, which includes agriculture, municipal solid waste and wastewater, coal mines, and oil and gas. So why focus on the biogas sector? Well, the biogas sector, which encompasses agriculture, municipal solid waste, and wastewater, accounts for approximately 20% of global anthropogenic methane emissions. And there are a number of benefits associated with capturing and utilizing biogas, including mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, producing renewable energy, and improving public health. And there are many technology options that are available on the market to capture and utilize biogas, including landfill gas collection and control systems, and anaerobic digester systems. And establishing an effective measurement, reporting, and verification system for biogas projects is really critical for accounting for the emission reduction benefits from biogas projects. Measurement refers to the tracking and documentation of data and information on greenhouse gas emissions and emission reductions from a project. For biogas projects, this can involve installing a biogas flow meter or directly monitoring methane emissions. Reporting involves disseminating the measured greenhouse gas emissions and emission reduction data and information using standardized methods and formats. And verification involves independently assessing the reported emissions and emission reductions to ensure completeness and accuracy. And this is typically done through an independent third-party verification body. MRV can be designated at different scales at the international level. For the purpose of MRV is to promote trust and accountability while fulfilling any international reporting obligations, such as those under the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. At the national level, MRV provides a comprehensive picture of national emissions through whether it's greenhouse gas emissions inventories or others, which can then feed into international reporting obligations and inform national goals and priorities. And then further down at the organizational, facility, or project level, MRV can support policymaking by providing emissions and emission reduction data. And this is really helpful to assess the impacts of mitigation projects and track the progress towards mitigation targets. And today's webinar is focused on project level MRV. And this is considered bottom-up approach because it's tracking emissions and emission reductions at the ground level. You're now going to see the first polling question for today on the right of your screen. And that polling question is on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your knowledge of measurement, reporting, and verification for biogas projects? Great, it looks like some answers are coming in. Most folks are on the relatively low side. So we're really happy to be here, happy to have you here today, and hopefully get your comfort level with biogas project level MRV up a little higher. So now we want to dive into some of the best practices for MRV in the biogas sector, and largely the next following slides are going to explore some of the content from the newly developed Policymakers Handbook for Measurement, Reporting, and Verification in the biogas sector, which was developed by the Global Methane Initiative. And the purpose of this handbook is really to help countries and organizations establish MRV systems for the biogas sector. The handbook focuses on best practices at the project level, including anaerobic digestion projects or landfill gas projects, and draws on technical guidance and tools from existing protocols and knowledge from MRV experts. But before diving into the handbook, we have another polling question for everyone. What can biogas project level MRV data be used for? All right, great. We have many smart test takers on the call today. We have most people said all of the above, which is the correct answer. If you did answer the other ones, those are also correct, but all of the above is the correct one. Okay, so let's dive in. So biogas project MRV can be used in several ways. First, it can be used to help develop robust national inventories. Many governments use tier 1 methods for estimating emissions in the biogas sector, which have very low certainty because they're based on generic models and default values. So governments often rely on tier 1 methods because of the limited data availability. But by collecting and using project level MRV data, governments can move beyond tier 1 methods into tiers 2 and 3, which have higher levels of certainty because, again, they use country-specific and facility-specific data. Project level data can be used to help refine methane recovery rates, develop country-specific emission factors, and improve the accuracy of data on activities that contribute to or avoid emissions. In addition to developing national inventories, biogas project MRV can also help countries enhance mitigation targets, policies, and actions. It can also increase access to external funding sources by demonstrating to financiers or funders the prospective or actual mitigation benefits from those investments. And really the most important component of MRV is the measurement of data. Developing and implementing a comprehensive measurement plan is a critical first step in this process. And a measurement plan provides a facility personnel with a blueprint of the key steps in collecting and managing data on emissions reductions from a project. The plan should include general information on the facility and operations, the role and responsibilities of facility personnel, and a description of the mitigation project or the activities. And it should also describe what data and information is needed to be collected on the project or activities and discuss how that data and information can be collected. And the method to quantify those emission reductions should be detailed in the measurement plan as well. And so speaking of quantifying emission reductions, the first step of quantifying emission reductions is establishing a baseline. And the baseline is really a measurement of the emissions without the mitigation project. And so this baseline really serves as a reference point to help calculate what the change in emissions are. And so with this baseline, emission reductions can then be estimated either before project implementation or after implementation has begun. Emissions reductions estimated before project implementation can be useful as part of a project feasibility assessment or a project proposal. And these estimates are based on modeling and will have significant margin of error. However, this uncertainty can be reduced by using historical values or by sampling a subset of the population for key parameters. So, for example, although biogas generation at a landfill can't be accurately measured without biogas collection and a metering system, a first order decay model, which is based on annual disposal rates at a landfill and estimated waste decay and methane generation rates, is useful for estimating potential methane emissions over time. So emissions reductions estimated after project implementation can also be useful to track progress in mitigation efforts. And this can be directly measured through biogas flow meters, for example, or can be modeled. And of course, direct measurement will be more accurate. And emission reduction quantification should occur at least annually during the course of a given measurement period. Certain data parameters should be monitored at a frequency that's really representative of what's needed to accurately calculate emission reductions. And a recommended best practice would be to install flow meters to provide biogas measurements on a continuous basis. And these flow meters should be maintained and calibrated to increase data accuracy. Project operators can also develop targeted sampling strategies that detail the best times of day and season to sample. And typically, greenhouse gas mitigation programs will provide guidance on the frequency of data measurement. And in the handbook, we have a full list of cost-free biogas emission quantification tools, including GMI's solid waste emissions estimation tool, which can be found on the GMI website. Okay, we have another polling question on the screen. What is the best practice for dealing with missing data when monitoring or data recording equipment fails? Okay, great. Yes, the answer is B and C. If monitoring or data equipment or project, if monitoring or data equipment fails, project operators should check if their greenhouse gas mitigation programs have specific requirements and methods for substituting missing data. And you can also refer to the IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories for methods for resolving any data gaps. And that may include methods for interpolation or trend extrapolation. Okay, so the next component of MRV is reporting of emissions and emissions reductions data. So project operators can report this data to a range of reporting program administrators depending on whatever their specific objectives are. So, for example, reports might be submitted to national government agencies as mandated under national greenhouse gas emission reporting programs. They could also be reported to local governments as required under municipal emissions inventories. Or they could be reported to voluntary programs such as the Carbon Disclosure Project, or financial institutions or carbon offset program administrators. And really, the type of information to be reported and the level of detail will vary depending on the reporting program. And the final component of MRV is verification. Verification for all biogas projects involves the same basic steps, which Zach will discuss in greater detail in his presentation. But as a best practice, greenhouse gas data and information should be verified by a third-party verification body to ensure impartiality and reduce risks. And verifications should be conducted using a standard and a criteria. And while it's best practice to report annually, verification may occur every other year, every 3 years, or even less frequently if an initial verification is conducted early in the project's life cycle. And the frequency of verification is often dictated by the program or at the request of a developer or owner. So that was a high-level overview of some of the best practices for MRV from the GMI handbook on MRV best practices for biogas sector. Again, that resource is available on the GMI website. And there's a lot of other great information on MRV in the biogas sector on the Global Methane Initiative website. So now I'm going to turn it over to Gerardo Canales to talk about measurement and reporting best practices. And Gerardo, just to introduce you quickly, is the executive director at Implementa Sur and has more than 20 years of experience in climate change, waste and circular economy, and clean energy policy and implementation. Presently, he works with countries and cities in Latin America, Africa, and the Pacific to identify, develop, and implement mitigation actions, develop NDC implementation strategies, and other climate-related initiatives. So thank you so much for being here, Gerardo, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks so much to GMI, EPA for this invitation, and also for the constant technical assistance and guidance that you have provided to different work in the region in the last decade. So always a pleasure to share with you some ideas. I'm from Implementa Sur, as Nick said. Implementa Sur is a consulting firm based in Santiago de Chile. We focus on climate change issues, and basically we try to help organizations identify what can they do to tackle climate change and how to get to those goals. So we work with organizations through diagnosis, strategy, and implementation, which is really our focus given the actual crisis that we have. So we have clients in the private sector and also work a lot with international cooperation organizations. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about MRV in Chile, particularly some MRV work that we develop within the program RECICLO ORGÁNICOS. So in general, MRV in Chile, well, there are some 13 MRV initiatives in the country at the present. 3 classified as emissions initiatives, 5 has mitigation action initiatives, in 5 MRV systems that address both emission and mitigation actions. Some examples for these types of MRV, we have the Huella Chile carbon management program, which is basically a platform provided by the government where any organization can go in and report their emissions. And for mitigation actions, we have, for example, the RECICLO ORGÁNICOS program, which is the one that I'm going to cover today, where we develop 3 MRV protocols for the three main technologies, anaerobic digestion, landfill gas capture, and composting. Basically, to have a methodology or three methodologies that are tailor-made for the country. Of course, they are based on international recognized methodologies, but some emission factors and or type of indicators were set specifically for Chile. So the RECICLO Orgánicos, it was a program funded by the Canadian government, a $7 million program over 5 years. And basically, the main objective was to help Chile achieve their NDC for the waste sector. It was a very successful program and now has expanded to over a dozen countries in Latin America and the Pacific with the same objective. So we are very happy that the program is expanding. So within this program, as I said before, we developed 3 different MRV protocols, and today I'm going to focus a little bit on the anaerobic digestion one. So of course, like any methodology, we had to identify which activities were included within the protocol, what was the scope of the protocol. So basically, we focused on organic waste streams that were diverted from landfills or waste disposal sites. And also for manure diversion, we defined also which systems were eligible as the ones that from where the organic waste could be diverted from. Also, during the development of the methodology, of course, we had to define which were the boundaries of the projects that could be included in the methodology, defining basically what will be considered within the project estimations and what could be left out, basically. So that's very important to know in advance. Important to say that this methodology was built together with several stakeholders. So a technical working group was set up, including representatives from government, from the private sector, and from universities. So it was a discussion that took, I think, over 2 years since the first meeting until we got the final protocols. But it was very interesting, fruitful, and I think everybody participating there learned a lot. Also, we had to define the baseline. I mean, which facilities basically where was basically the waste going today, and that was the baseline that we defined for this methodology. Also, in terms of how the destruction of methane could happen, of course, we needed to define what's the kind of equipment that we need to measure the destruction of methane. So we included in methodology details. For example, has the flow of biogas delivered to each destruction device, measured continuously and recorded every 15 minutes, or a totalize recorded at least daily. So we had to include all these details into the methodology. So it was a very prescriptive guideline for users. Then also we define other information such as which is the efficiency of different destruction devices. We based these factors on already available international literature and other methodologies. So as I said, we analyze different methodologies that already existed, and we took from them what we considered that was the better option for Chile. Also, we had the opportunity to test a blockchain application. So the RECICLO Orgánicos program, in addition to developing these methodologies, of course, we were supporting specific projects. So we took two of the projects that we were supporting, one landfill gas project and one anaerobic digestion plant. And we set up some pilots of blockchain applications at these facilities. Of course, the methodology behind these blockchain applications were the methodologies that we developed for the program, these protocols. So, I mean, in simple terms, a blockchain application basically it's like a real-time monitoring and recording of information. So the different instruments that are measuring the methane flow at the plant are connected to a computer, and that information is sent over to a digital MRV platform on real time, and also encrypted for any other use. So basically, each ton of CO2 equivalent that it's been reduced, it's communicated and reported on real time in a very secure and cost-effective way. So also this platform, well, we build a platform where you can basically go in and check the information. There is information on each of the projects where you can see the location and of course what has been the emission reductions over time. So it's a really friendly interface that you can go in, I mean users can go in and check the information and emission reductions at any time. So you can, the interface, you can set up different graphs and take different information. Also, you can access a virtual tour of the plant where you can zoom in on different destruction devices or measurement devices and see how they are working. What are some pending tasks for the future to really make best use of these methodologies? Well, probably to have like a framework document for the country, providing all policy decisions surrounding the use of these methodologies could be developed, basically to guide potential users on GHG quantification and what can they do also with these reduction units. In Chile, for instance, we have a carbon tax that is in the process of being enacted, and sorry, an offset system it's soon to be implemented, and having these methodologies for specific technologies also opens opportunities for project developers to participate in that offset market that it's being created. So potential next steps for the country, as I said, developing of this GHG framework, probably developing other GHG quantification protocols for other high priority sectors. I mean, basically Chile could have, we could have our own methodologies for different typologies of emission reduction projects. Hopefully we could extend the monitoring period on the projects that we have already working in, and also apply the digital MRV system to other facilities. It's not very complex, and it's really a useful tool. As I said, this kind of methodologies and systems would allow the participation of projects on different emission reduction schemes, like ITMOS, for instance, or any other similar scheme. And also to have good MRV at project level, of course, increases the confidence and transparency when reporting national emission reductions. So hopefully someday the information from projects can feed into the national inventory, for instance. So that's from our side, and thank you so much for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Gerardo. Okay, so our next speaker is Zach Eiler, and Zach is going to discuss best practices for biogas verification. And just to introduce Zach quickly, Zach is the vice president at Ruby Canyon Environmental and oversees operation of Ruby Canyon's greenhouse gas assurance work worldwide. Zach has over 15 years of experience with greenhouse gas reporting and markets, and has conducted hundreds of verifications for offset projects and greenhouse gas reporting clients. And Zach has worked in numerous carbon offset programs across a wide variety of sectors and project types. And so thank you so much for being here, Zach, and I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone. Glad to be here and to share, some of our experiences as being a verification body and best practices as it relates to biogas projects. Real quick about Ruby Canyon Environmental. We were founded in 2005. We're actually recently acquired by TÜV Americas in December of last year. They're a large international testing, inspection, and certification company. But yeah, our role in the marketplace is typically as a third-party validation and verification body, providing third-party assurance, both for greenhouse gas reporting for clients and facilities, but also, and more of our focus today, in greenhouse gas reduction projects, carbon offsets, as we commonly known. Over our history, we've completed over 1,500 assurance engagements worldwide since 2009. We are accredited by multiple groups that accredit validation and verification bodies. I'm based in Grand Junction, Colorado, and we also have a subsidiary company, Ruby Canyon Mexico, that's based in Mexico City and leads all of our Latin America work. We do work in all kinds of different sectors, but on today's webinar, we do have a lot of methane capture experience with coal mines, landfills, livestock operations, and wastewater. But we also work in forestry, land use, renewable energy, and other types of sectors. And yeah, we try to be in almost most programs that are out there in today's world, both in the compliance market and in voluntary markets. So a quick slide on sort of the verification overview. I call the basics. Nick touched on some of these things, but I mean, at a high level, when we conduct a verification, we're providing assurance both on the methods that a project is using to quantify how many credits they're going to get, the emission reductions, so the numbers. And we're also working to assure that the project is meeting any program rules. I mentioned, there's a lot of programs out there that have a variety of different requirements that projects need to meet to be eligible. Verification, at least in our, no one likes to get audited, but, in our opinion, the verification process does provide opportunities for projects to improve their overall MRV, which is very valuable. I think Nick also mentioned that the frequency of how often verifications occur. This does vary by program, and it can be like all over the map, like Nick mentioned, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and even longer for some land use and forestry projects. But it is important early on in the project cycle to, I think, conduct a verification, because again, it does provide value. And the findings that we raise can help a project going forward in the future. A physical site visit is usually required for verifications, especially the first time that a company like ours would conduct a verification for a project. Whether it's required in the future depends, but a physical site visit, and I'll talk more about it in a future slide, is very valuable in our opinion during the verification process to confirm that the project is doing everything correctly. While a verification and we view it as a partnership with our clients, it is not consulting. It is done, as a third party in an impartial manner. And so, we can't tell our clients the answers. We can tell you when it's incorrect, but we can't tell you the answer because then we would end up auditing our own answer. So it's important that it's done in an impartial manner, and that's, provides integrity to the verifications we conduct. A little bit more on the overview of verification. This is focused on criteria and standards. Nick also mentioned this at a high level. We conduct it to specific standards. One is ISO standards. This is, I mentioned 14064-3 2019. this is the process that us as a verifier follows to conduct the verification. And we're audited against that. So the auditors get audited once a year to maintain our accreditations. And that's what we get audited against, is that standard. And then all the programs have their own requirements and program standards and guides, which we will use to audit projects against. Then there's really two main criteria is also very important. There's two main ones that are very consistent across all kind of carbon programs. One is materiality threshold. And this is when we conduct our review of your measurements, your calculations of emission reductions and your final credit numbers. We need to ensure that they're within a certain materiality threshold, which is usually set by the program. The most common is plus or minus 5%. And so if we confirm that your final credit number is within plus or minus 5%, you're all good and we can sign off on it. We do see sometimes different thresholds, 1%, 3%. That's typically for very large projects that generate a lot of credits. The other one is the level of assurance, and pretty much standard across all carbon credit generation programs is a reasonable level of assurance. This is an auditing term. And that level of assurance requires us to see source documentation and evidence to support and back up your numbers and any other requirements of the program. So there's also a limited level of assurance, but that's more for greenhouse gas reporting and is not really relevant in the carbon credit space. It's all reasonable level of assurance because these credits are being transacted, they're being used for compliance obligations, and so that high level of assurance is required from our side. And it's important, finally, to agree to all these items above before you start the verification. It's actually not allowed at this point following new ISO standards. We can't start our verification and then all of a sudden change criteria halfway through. We'd have to start over again. Here's a quick diagram on the verification process. I'll go sort of quickly through these. So at the start of any engagement with one of our clients is the receipt of the initial data and documentation from them. And so oftentimes we send them a list of what we'd like to see. And so they share all this document and data with us. We start to review it. And the first step that we would conduct is a strategic analysis. This is sort of a high-level review of the project, who's involved, what is the criteria, what sector is it in, and just, in terms of it sort of blends and leads into our risk assessment. And the risk assessment is where we focus on specific aspects of a project to determine if it's a low risk, medium risk, or high risk. For example, if it's the initial verification for a project, the baseline assessment in reviewing the baseline to ensure it's accurate is a high risk. It's a very important step. And so we would mark that as a high risk. And then based on our risk assessment, based on high risk or medium risk, that goes into how we design our verification and sampling plan, or now called evidence gathering plan. And that's our plan for what we're going to look at and how much we're going to look at it. So if the baseline is a high risk, well, in our evidence gathering plan, it's going to say we're going to look at the baseline, the numbers that go into it, the data that goes into it, the documentation that supports it, and we're going to sample and review that in detail. Whereas other areas that are low risk, we might not look at as much. So that's sort of our guide, is this risk assessment in terms of how much we look at. So we conduct that review. After our plan is set, we conduct our review, the data and documentation. We conduct a site visit if required or if warranted. And after that, and I'll show you an example here in a minute, we put together a document noting any issues that we found. And we sort of go through that with the client. If there's issues that, the risk assessment can change. It's sort of an iterative process. If we find something new that we didn't realize, we can actually go back and revise our risk assessment, and sort of the cycle doesn't start over, but it feedbacks into it. But ultimately, once all the findings are closed, we will, and are assured that you've met the materiality requirements and all the other requirements of the program, wish you a verification statement or an opinion. This is usually a 1 or 2 page document that says Ruby Canyon reviewed this project for this time period against this criteria, and ultimately we're signing off on a certain amount of credits. And that's usually the final document that you would give to a program that they would then issue credits against. This is basically just what I just said, but more in detail. I'm not going to read through it and just skip over, but you can look at this later on if you would like. So focusing on site visits specifically, this is a really key important part of it, of the verification process, like I mentioned. So these are some of the example topics that we would cover on a site visit. Typically, a site visit to a biogas project would last no more than 1 day. Only if it was really complicated or involved maybe multiple entities would it last longer than that. But we would, for example, I mentioned baseline scenario already. We would review that on site. So at a livestock project, if we're talking with the farmer, we would talk to them about, okay, again, this is what the scenario of what would happen prior to, a digester being built, for example. How did you manage your manure before the project happened? Did it go 100% to the lagoons? Was it managed in, open lots, dry lots? Did you have a solid separator on site? And so asking those kind of questions to the farmer directly is very valuable during the site visit. At a landfill, the question could be talking to landfill, operations staff. Did you collect gas ever prior to the collection system being installed? Was it destroyed? Were there passive flares on site, solar flares, those kind of questions? And it's important to talk to those kind of face-to-face and one-on-one. It's usually very valuable, we think. On site, you also want to review data management. So we're talking about biogas flow, methane concentrations, et cetera. How is that data recorded? What is the equipment? We want to also review your information control system. So tracing data from start to finish. So it's recorded by this device at the flow meter, and then it ends up all the way at the end in the emission reduction calculations where you're getting your final credit numbers. So how does that process work? Having the client walk us through step by step how that data flows from start to finish. Obviously, reviewing monitoring equipment is important, and the QA/QC of it. So how reviewing calibration certificates for flow meters or methane analyzers, talking to the staff or whoever is conducting that QA/QC work. How are you calibrating the equipment? How are you checking the accuracy? What is your ongoing operation and maintenance like? Those questions are important on the site visit. And then, finally, just touring the project, getting to see the equipment itself, inspection of all the GHG sources, sinks, and reservoirs. We saw that graph earlier of all those boxes that Gerardo showed. Seeing the different types where the manure is being managed in the project scenario would be very important. Sometimes, fossil fuel and electricity consumption, need to review those meters. Seeing the actual monitoring equipment, flow meters and methane analyzers, reviewing the serial numbers on site to make sure they match up to the documents that you've been provided, and also seeing data collection equipment, which I already mentioned. So these are some of the common problems we see during verifications. After 1,500 of them, we've seen lots of different problems over the years. So, basic things like using wrong emission factors, unit conversions being incorrect in the spreadsheets. At a higher level, oftentimes people have very complicated calculations, and, there'll be 10 spreadsheets that we need to look at. And that can be very difficult to trace if they're all, intermingled and are not connected well enough. Because, again, like I mentioned, we have to trace data back to its origin. And if it's hard to do that and very complicated, it takes more time, and also important to our clients, takes more money. Also, we see an example I call black box calculator tool. These are great for clients because, they've hired someone to put together a great tool where it collects the data and auto calculates the amount of, emission reductions and credits they're going to get. So from the client side, that's great. It makes their life easier. But from our auditor's side, it actually can make our life more difficult because it's a black box and I can't see in there. I can't see under the hood. And again, tracing data and tracing calculations is very important. And so that can be difficult for us to overcome. You can overcome it, but it just might take more time. A couple other quick ones, for QA/QC, manufacturers need to, follow, you're supposed to calibrate your meters, and you should be doing that. Not having an internal QA/QC program for calculations, and then just lacking source documentation. Again, reasonable level assurance, we need to see source documentation. This is an example findings document. For example, these are actually real findings from a project. I've obviously changed the name. Project's not actually called Cal's Biogas Project, but these are real findings from a verification. And so there's a couple different buckets here. A corrective action request is something that has to be corrected, or we can't complete the verification. So in this instance, there's data substitution. So they're missing some data. They're missing data for biogas flow, and there's procedures that you're supposed to follow to substitute for that missing data, and they were doing it incorrectly, and they needed to correct it. There's some non-material findings, and so I mentioned materiality threshold earlier. So these are errors that we found that are less than 5%. So it's up to the client. They don't necessarily have to correct them. They can if they want. Most clients correct everything because they want to be accurate, but it's up to them. So these are like typos that we found in the calculations or something that they just did incorrectly. Here they had some, in terms of their herd count, this is a livestock project. They just had some typos in terms of the number of animals at a certain time. Additional documentation requests. This is something that we want to see more data on. And then the final bucket is a clarification request. So something more we want to discuss with the client and just walk through to figure out what happened here. So in this case, this is a digester project. There was a venting event where the cover came off. There's a way to calculate how much methane was vented, and we just wanted to discuss that with them. So last two slides are sort of keys to success for verification. This is sort of going back to some of the original MRV principles. Completeness. So we need to be able, the client needs to provide to us all the data and documentation that we need to see. And a good way to do that, and Nick already mentioned this, is have a measurement plan, a monitoring plan that ensures that all the data and documentation is recorded, saved, and organized in a manner so that the verification body can look at it easily. Transparency, we've already talked about this. We need to trace data from its start to its finish. And so designing your calculations, designing your program in a way that is easily traceable for the verifier from a data and equation standpoint. And accuracy, obviously it needs to be accurate to the materiality threshold. So have an internal QA/QC program for the calculations. And the last ones, I think it's important when you start a verification, make sure everyone is on the same page in terms of who's responsible for what the parties are involved. Communication is really important during the verification process. It always ensures that a good audit occurs. Presenting the data and documents in an organized manner. I've seen clients drop 200 files into a folder and they're not organized, and that makes my life really hard to review that. So presenting the data in an organized manner, and then responding to any questions we have, like that list of findings document, in a timely manner. If we don't hear from our clients for multiple months and they respond months later, it's hard for us to sort of pick back up the verification because we have to relearn it. And it just sort of drags the process on. So ensuring constant communication, frequent communication is important. And viewing this whole process as a means to improve your system. I already said that. No one likes to be audited, but if you use our findings as a way to improve your system so that it's more accurate in the future, that's a great way to view an audit, I think. And then Nick mentioned this as well, but as carbon markets are expanding, there's more projects out there. I think it's very valuable that when you do have a verifier and hire them, they are accredited, which ensures that it's a high quality review that you get. And that is it for me. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Zach. And thank you, Gerardo, as well. Those were fantastic presentations on some of the practical and real experience from folks that are measuring, reporting, and verifying projects. Before going into the question and answer session of today, I just want to wrap up and kind of summarize today what we heard today. So in the first segment, I shared an overview of GMI's policymaker handbook for MRV in the biogas sector and talked through some of the high-level guidance on MRV best practices. And again, that resource is available on the Global Methane Initiative website. Gerardo talked through the anaerobic digestion protocol for RECICLO ORGÁNICOS program, which is an excellent case study for MRV of biogas projects. And Zach talked through some of the steps to verify success, which involve following the original MRV principles and clearly communicating the verification processes. Just as a reminder too, this webinar today is part 3 of a 3-part MRV webinar series that GMI has hosted. And to see parts 1 and 2, you can visit the Global Methane Initiative website. So that brings us to the question and answer session of today. And we have a few questions that have come in. I encourage you to continue to type in your questions if you have them, but we'll open up the floor now for those questions. And I'll start with the first one. This one's from Joe. What are recommendations for estimating the percentage of methane in biogas when using a flow meter? Maybe I'll turn that over to you, Zach.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, well, the flow meter will just measure the flow of the gas, but in terms of the percentage of methane, there's two options that we see at projects. One is a continuous methane analyzer. So this is a inline device that is continuously measuring the methane content of the gas. Those are more expensive, but they provide you, typically more accuracy and definitely more frequent recordings of the methane percentages. And then also some programs allow the use of handheld methane measurement devices. These are portable devices like Landtech gyms, for example. And that's where a person will, go hook up their machine to a sampling port and take a sample of the methane. I think Gerardo mentioned, in that protocol he discussed, you just have to take a methane sample once a quarter, every 3 months. And so that would be using that type of device. So obviously you get less measurement amounts with that if you're doing it by hand, but they're also much less cheaper. So there is that kind of trade-off between those two types of devices.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Question about the recordings. Yes, this webinar will be recorded and we'll post it on the Global Methane Initiative website. The next question, what other emissions quantification tools would you recommend? I can start out with that one. I mentioned the solid waste emissions estimation tool from the Global Methane Initiative. That's a great tool for quantifying emissions from and potential emission reductions from landfill gas capture systems or anaerobic digestion systems, or diverting the waste to a composting facility. There's a number of tools in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Biogas Toolkit, which can also help quantify emissions and emission reductions in the pre-feasibility stage. Those are the anaerobic digestion screening tool, looking at the emissions and emission reductions from anaerobic digesters. And there's also a landfill gas screening tool, which is again a sort of a pre-feasibility tool that can help estimate emissions and emission reductions from projects. Those are some of the ones that I'd recommend from EPA. And Zach or Gerardo, do you have other recommendations?
A lot of our clients actually develop, their own tool. And so, no, I think the references you mentioned are the ones I would say too.
Okay. Great. Another question. How do you deal with fugitive emissions on plants?
Well, I guess I'll try to answer if I understand the question. I would say that most of the protocols and methodologies that projects follow to generate their amount of carbon credits and emission reductions, the fugitive emissions are not calculated directly, and they might be in some of the default factors that are included in the calculation, like the destruction efficiency numbers that Gerardo showed for open flares or an engine, for example. That's assuming that not all the methane is combusted. And so, some of it might be captured in the default factors that are included in the calculation, but typically you don't see any kind of direct measurement or requirement for fugitive emissions.
I think there's a follow-up question to that is, which program or protocol does the example you gave follow. And I think that was referring to Zach, your presentation.
Let's see. So maybe the example, I don't know, list of findings, or I'm not sure what what example they're referring to, but yeah, I guess some of the, the things I highlighted come from a lot of the programs we work in, which would, in the voluntary carbon market, would be the Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry, and then VERA, the Verified Carbon Standard. Those are the three most prominent voluntary carbon markets that we work in today.
Great, thanks. Another question is, based on your experience, which is the main barrier to projects in developing countries having a successful third-party verification, mainly for waste projects?
And in our experience, I think, and it's really not necessarily different between developing countries and developed countries. We see a lot of the same problems regardless. And it's mostly just, it is that source data and documentation, and ensuring that, every program or every project has a specific protocol or methodology they have to follow. And when we audit a project, we're going to go down the list and we're going to review every single requirement of that protocol, and ensuring that the project has the document or data to support all of that is usually, one of the biggest issues is that they just don't. And so then they have to go try to find it, which can take time, or, sometimes they can't find it. And then we have to, if allowable, come up with another solution for us to verify it. So having that source data and documentation for all the requirements is really a huge piece of it.
Great. I think we have time for just one more, and we'll happy to answer and follow up on the questions that we didn't get to today. But the last question is the emissions baseline plant specific? And I can just start off that I would say, it's important to get baseline to estimate emissions from a project, specifically. There's a number of tools that I mentioned that can help you estimate those emissions, but really you need to understand each project is unique and has different emissions profiles. So it would be plant specific to get that baseline.
Yeah, Nick, maybe if I can add something. For instance, in developing the protocols for Chile, there are different situations in different regions. In Chile, I don't know, organic waste in the north of Chile doesn't decompose in the same way as in the south, where it's much more humid and rainy. So we did incorporate into the protocol specific emission factors for different regions. Also, for instance, in Santiago, most of the waste goes to engineered landfills, which is not the case, in engineered landfills that already have methane destruction devices, even for electricity generation. That's not the same situation in other regions of the country. So we could say that there is some relationship between where the project is located and the specific baseline that you're going to use for it.
Wonderful. Thank you. And there are a few outstanding questions which we'll try our best to respond to in a follow-up email. So with that, I just want to thank